Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. I'm really happy to be in this really nice space, open to conversations. My name is Laura Vidal, and I'm Venezuelan. I'm based in France. I'm an independent researcher. And what I'm going to present to you today is an emerging project. It's very much in the making and in the process of refining questions and observing the fieldwork. So, I'm also doing this work in the company of a collective that is also emerging that is called Curious Shapes, and it brings together other researchers and other communicators working in the digital rights space where we support each other and exchange ideas. So I also wanted to put some of the organizations I've been collaborating with in the last years, not because they are immersed in this research, but because my work in collaboration with them has informed these questions. As I am an independent researcher, I am also the regional editor for IFIX, which is a network of organizations from Canada and that works globally in the defense of freedom of speech. So following this issue, for example, I used to work with Global Voices and Advox following internet shutdowns, problems with access, and also blockades of independent media. With the engine room, I could study a little bit the journey that Amnesty International took to integrate digital rights into their work. And also now in IFEX, I follow issues of surveillance and also all issues that have to do with the protection of journalists and freedom of speech in the Americas. So all of this has informed the questions that I've been asking myself as I study these issues, and also because I had this little frustration that in all of the news about Venezuela that you can find in international media, the digital side of the conflict was not there. But recently, like this year, I saw that the Deutsche Welle in their academy were following some of the activities of journalists in Venezuela and how they're taking advantage of different platforms and talking to people, and also Global Voices through their Advox project. They have an Freedom report, and they just published a Venezuela chapter, which summarizes really well what's going on, which is very complicated. So I guess that, you ask to the universe and the universe responds somehow. So I want to start by saying that this is very much a story of power and counterpower. So government pushes, and then you have civil society and journalists responding. It's very much of give and take thing. It's not just one process. It's very complex, and it has this rhythm of power and counterpower. The thing with the access of information in Venezuela is that the limitations are extremely complex, and they're not made of one problem. You have, for example, problems with electricity. This has been going on for years. Big electricity cuts all along the country, sometimes in regions, sometimes in different parts of the city, but it's a constant, and it has become part of the daily life. The same thing, and this also started some years ago, problems accessing paper. This was very important for news outlets, especially newspapers that had to close down nationally, locally, and regionally. And it's not only the question of paper, there's also legal harassment, economic harassment. Most newspapers have to push their work online, where you'll guess is not the best scenario afterwards. It's important also to say that the radio is also is an environment that is very much under threat. In the last 20 years, hundreds of radio stations have been shut down, and that number is rising. Every week, every 2 weeks, I see news of not only radio stations but also shows being taken off air because of the information that they're trying to disseminate. And all of that tends to happen without much explanation to somebody, from the institution in charge of communication saying, we need to shut you down. It's orders from above. So you see, it's a whole environment that has blockades from everywhere. It's electricity, it's paper, it's the radio, and then the internet. The internet is famously slow in Venezuela. It's probably one of the slowest in the whole region. And then you have the issue of infrastructure and the issue of service, but also the issue of direct attacks, outlets being blocked, journalists being harassed, trolls. I mean, you name it. It's a very complex net of strategies really meant to block information and control the media. So you have here some little examples of what happens online in terms of attacks. And these numbers come from the Institute of Press and Society, EPIS. They recorded a total of 59 violations, and this was only in 2022. And this continues to happen. There's denial of services, DDoS attacks, identity theft, doxing, and so on. And of course, a lot of discourse coming from the government against the press. So, and it's not only the use of the public channels for this, it's also pushing through private service providers. Oftentimes, private service providers get pressured to take content down. And also, recently there was a report from Telefónica, which is the parent company of Movistar, which is another private service provider, and they found out that by order of the government, something like 20% of their users had their communications somehow intercepted, either tapped or having their location found. So we really have a whole system, a whole complex system that feeds itself out of the economic crisis, the political crisis, the infrastructural crisis, and the result is journalists working with very little resources, having to navigate a lot of challenges. And this takes me to the part of the counterpower. You saw that the power is pretty big, pretty complex, and coming from many sides. But the counterpower is also meant to navigate this. So far, what I've seen is that this counterpower is being led by civil society and journalists. And they play with resources and very creative initiatives that take place online and offline in collaboration with other outlets, with civil society, and with international organizations as well. I found this a few days ago. I thought it was really fun. It was a really fun way to, denounce what was going on. Efecto Cocuyo, which is one of the most important independent outlets in Venezuela, is selling NFTs with the messages that you get when they have been blocked. And that's a way that they can get support. If you want to support some of the work that they're doing, you can buy an NFT. So there's also this, as I was saying, this combination of online and offline. This is one of the most popular initiatives. They have had some attention by international media because you have some journalists getting to buses, reading the news to people, basically. I have a video here so you can see more or less what the dynamic is. I hope it plays. There you go. So this is a report from the BBC that I took this from. From the Wall Street Journal. So it's been very much an international media, and you can see really the resourcefulness of these journalists. And they also have different editorial lines depending on the bus lines that they get into, and they feed that editorial lines in conversation with the people that they talk to, the commuters. There's also a big initiative of educating people regarding different tools to access information. You have this comes from El Pitazo, and this comes from Efecto Cocuyo. And they have this educational strategy, trying to explain people how VPNs work so they can access information. And at the same time, they have had also other alliances with international organizations making mirror sites. So the links that they share on social media are accessible and not as easily shut down as a regular link will be. Audio is another very important resource. The thing with radio and the big loss with radio is that radio tends to be the only way that local communities can inform themselves. So when you see a lot of radio stations closing down, there are big deserts of information. And so since audio is such a resource and it can also be disseminated rather easily, on social media. El Pitazo, for example, some of their coverage, they do it on audio, and as well as this other organization that is called the Servicio de Información Pública, and they disseminate their audios on WhatsApp and on Telegram mainly. They used to do it on SoundCloud, but SoundCloud got blocked. So again, going the power counter power, you see that is a kind of a chess game. Journalists do one thing and then the government responds with something else, and so on and so forth. And this is another very, very interesting initiative from El Pitazo, and this has been studied by the Deutsche Welle Academy, and is that they use forums on chats with WhatsApp. So they have groups on WhatsApp where they can talk to their readers. Oftentimes actually, they invite experts that can answer questions directly to their readers, and they also have a dialogue with the readers, so they can have sources in many parts of the country, basically, so they can keep writing news. So in these initiatives, readers and followers of these outlets are very much involved in the news and the information that they disseminate, and it's definitely a way to keep the information going. Then this is probably my favorite initiative, and it comes from an organization called Venezuela Inteligente, and they have a collection of videos explaining the basics of digital security. They are very entertaining, they're quite friendly, and they're also culturally relevant. You can definitely say that this is a resource by Venezuelans, for Venezuelans, but also for the rest of Latin America. I had conversations with digital security trainers that said that this has been very useful for them when they're training other people. And in the case of digital security in particular, I feel that this is such a complicated area of knowledge. It's never easy to ask questions. It can be pretty scary. It's connected with things that are not necessarily easy to understand. So you get these two young activists just explaining how do you use a VPN, how can you have safer passwords, what does this, and this mean? You can really feel that these are the people and the environments in which you can definitely ask questions and also understand the human side of digital security, because strategies and tools will definitely change and evolve, but human behavior is something that if you understand it very well, you can navigate tools a lot better. And that's something that these videos tend to clarify in a really, really smart way. And by the way, coming back with the power counter power thing, you see that in this video in particular, they are talking about VPNs, and so they're recommending Siphon, and they're also recommending TunnelBear. The pages of TunnelBear and Siphon were blocked after these videos got viral. So you can tell that you can measure that as impact as well, I feel. So also, one really interesting thing is that there are interesting alliances taking place between these organizations and these journalists. I know that Venezuela Inteligente has alliances with El Bus, with the bus, and they go to popular areas, sometimes giving USB keys with the videos downloaded. Because you need to think about connections, you need to think about electricity. There are many things that you really need to think about when trying to access these different tools and this information. So I do not have a conclusion. I have a bunch of stories that have very complicated thing going on here, and I definitely have no conclusions. I do have questions that I want to share with you here. And you see, if you remember, I am a researcher in education sciences and informal learning. So to me, this is definitely a question of freedom of speech, of digital rights, of human rights, but this is also a question of learning, informal learning, digital literacy. How can we examine and understand the learning processes taking place? They are very complex and they happen in many, many levels, in collaboration and independently. To what extent are people learning from journalists and human rights and digital rights defenders, and then from one another? Because this all works in networks. We all have WhatsApp groups that they are connected with other friends and other family members, many times, that live abroad. I can count myself as one of those. How does the diaspora also feed into this information process, into this learning how to disseminate information. The social filter, as one communicator calls it, is very important. Deciding what information actually flows within people's media landscapes. Also, how can digital literacy programs integrate experiences in limited environments, such as the ones Venezuelans have to face? Digital literacy is such a big issue, and we're having so many interesting conversations that are now integrating artificial intelligence into it, thinking about students, young people, people of different generations, and learning from one another. But access is also a huge element. How can we think about digital literacy when you have this system of limitations? To what extent do we need to add a kind of human element, a strategic element, adaptability element to digital literacy programs? And finally, almost finally, what can digital literacy programs learn from the experiences of countries having to learn how to access information and deal with technologically authoritarian regimes? Venezuela is by no means the only country going through this. Actually, governments take notes from one another. Nicaragua is also a very well-known country for being digitally authoritative. And also, how can digital literacy programs integrate ever-changing digital environments? How can they integrate power and counter-power? So, as I was saying before, one thing that I really want you to live with is this idea that these subjects, digital security, access to information, digital authoritarianism, they are issues that have to do with human rights, with civic space, with freedom of speech, with digital security, but also these are very much issues that have to do with digital and media literacy and about informal learning. Informal learning is this very difficult thing to measure, very difficult thing to describe, but it works a little bit like the dark matter, in the space. There's no way that we can describe and really quantify what dark matter is, but it's very difficult to understand the universe and space without having it into account. So there are ways that we need to develop to dialogue with how this works and to understand it. And that is all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura, very much for your talk. Are there any questions in the audience? Yes, one.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. So I'm very active in the radically leftist climate movement in Germany, and we also have the problem with data security and how can we keep our data safe. And therefore, we mostly use the messenger element. I don't know if you know that, and or the Tor browser, which is the most safe kind of accessing information. And I wanted to ask if that's used in Venezuela too, or if that's just this European thing or European activist thing.
Well, it's complicated. As a Venezuelan that lives abroad and has my parents there, it's very complicated to tell them, don't use WhatsApp, use Signal. Use VPN, use Tor. It's an ongoing struggle. But in terms of people working with environment, you're absolutely right. Digital security is a must, and in the Americas, it's definitely a must. If there are people that are in danger right now, are environmental journalists. I hope that answered your question.
Hello, thank you for the talk.
Hi.
So my question is, you mentioned it's about a balance between power and counter-power, that anytime you had something in place, the government is taking an action in order to respond to that. So I guess the bottleneck around accessing information is the technical skills, installing a VPN, accessing the Tor browser or whatever. So do you notice a fatigue about the reader to to always change and adapt different reflexes? And how do you manage this big issue that prevents you to reach a really wide audience?
That's a huge question, and it's really interesting thank you for asking that question. I think there's surely some fatigue on that. And in the case of Venezuela, it's not only the fatigue about getting the news, it's also the fatigue of daily life, of getting gas, of even many daily, very basic things entail such a process. So in terms of information, I believe that there's something that not only people living in tense environments like this one, but all of us, we all have to deal with some sort of fatigue in terms of choosing our information, choosing our tools, choosing the ways that we communicate and how we interact with this. I feel that these are things that need to be like drops. And again, I'm sorry, because since I'm a researcher in education, my answer will always come with an education element in it, because it's very important that we learn about these things from an early age. So it's not like a shock. Oh, shocker, there's a lot of fake news, shocker, there are news outlets that have positions, shocker, we need to be safe in certain ways, and these things are going to keep changing. Somehow I feel that we have learned it a little bit. If we think of the media and the digital landscape 5 years ago, it's very different from now. I don't think that the apps that you have on your phone are the same that the ones that you had 3 years ago. So I think that we live in the universe of change, really. This definitely is a spice of constant change, and that to me is the point to understand. Rather than to learn about this tool and this media, is learning that we need to navigate. We really need to be prepared to constantly move and navigate and kind of keep our ears open.
Are there any more questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you for coming.
You said something very important which resonates a lot with me, and that's the exchange of different experiences from counter-power measures. And I don't know, do you have any experience or examples where or how this kind of exchange could look like creating spaces to have like a global exchange, not only in Latin America, but maybe also from activist engagement, for example, like the one the colleague said in Germany. So do you have any ideas or examples that you can recall?
Well, I think that this should be the way of the future, really knowing that your issues are not only your issues. The Venezuelans are not the only ones having to go through these things, and nor they are the only ones with solutions. Actually, one really interesting thing, if we're talking about an example, is that the director of El Pitazo, one of the media outlets that I showed you that works with WhatsApp groups and so on, he got inspired in a conference in Brazil with another media called Nexta that used to do this sort of work of exchanging with the readers. So keeping the communication channels open is always a good thing. The ones that really understand this are authoritative governments. They definitely read each other's notes, they are in constant communication, they have a beautiful bond of solidarity. That means that activists should have it too. And I think one thing that I would encourage everyone to do is care about the news somewhere else. Care about international news. Don't think that certain things might not happen where you live. These things tend to be cyclical and they move around, and it's amazing what we can really learn from one another. So opening spaces, Global Voices, for example, is a really nice resource because they have news from all over the world and they have different online communities, but they're definitely not the only ones. Building communities with people all around the world around one value or a set of values that are coherent with one another, or about one subject, can definitely foster this sort of exchange and inspiration exchange as well.
Hello, Laura. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for coming.
It was really interesting. I wanted to know how do you think that social media works in a country like Venezuela? For example, Twitter or Instagram.
In terms of how people can access it, go this and this, you say yes, no. So in terms of how people can access, well, Twitter is accessible, and up until a few years ago, Twitter was the place to go. But as in every other country, Twitter is a mess in Venezuela, especially in a country that has very polarizing politics. So this is not all black and white. It's not like everybody's against and the other ones are. It's very it's extremely complex, as it tends to happen with polarizing governments. But yeah, a lot of social media, it's still accessible, definitely, but with all the mess that goes around it.
Oh, thank you very much. But are like these journalists making this buzz TV and making these videos, are they not in direct danger from the government, like wildly?
As they are when they're in war zones, when they are reporting about drug trafficking, about environmental issues. I was asking myself the same question, like, they're kind of exposing themselves, but they're still doing it. Again, it's power and counterpower, and I don't think the government can control everything, or they cannot really suppress all kinds of information. There's a way in which the system works in one, from one way or the other. But I really don't know what to tell you, because journalism is such a dangerous job. And I am pretty sure that most of the people, when they signed to become journalists, probably didn't know. But there's a rhythm, and there are news, and there are things going on. I could say the same thing, having my family in Venezuela and being in an international conference, talking about these things, I doubt oftentimes. But we're definitely not the only ones. But I definitely get your point. I don't like it either, and I feel so grateful for what they're doing. I hope I answered your question.
Hello, thank you as well. Can you maybe say one sentence to how you scale these information? Because delivering USB sticks to buses and hopping on buses with the ads, it's very, you don't reach the masses, and to change it to reach all the people, VPN, it's always barriers to reach them. So how do you access that scale?
I think that if we're talking about scale, it's important to think about smaller scale, because yes, getting to a lot of people, it's complicated because of all these problems. But it's very important not only to be able to get information to small communities, local communities that don't have access to the internet, to the news, to newspapers or whatever, and also get informed by these local communities. Oftentimes the news about blackouts, they come from people reporting there's no light here. There's no light, there's no electricity here. So it's not only about having one piece of information and blasted it all over the news nationally, but also caring for what's going on in local communities and how they respond to their own challenges and how they make their stories known as well.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I saw you had one.
I can't hear you.
Now?
I can hear you now.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask if you have any more suggestions for international news sites. I think you mentioned one earlier, but I didn't catch the name.
Oh, yeah, but they're not a news site. They're actually a community that has a website, and they're called Global Voices. And they have a parallel site that is called Advox that follows all of this news all around the world. And most of the communities is made of volunteers, so you can have very regular kind of information. It's definitely not a news site, so it's not a quick news flash, but they have really interesting projects like the Unfreedom Monitor. You can also follow IFEX, where I work. Again, IFEX is not a news outlet, but it follows issues of freedom of speech and access to information all around the world. Do you have any recommendations? Because I will think of following really international organizations rather than media and international news outlets, and also follow those organizations and see who they follow.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for being here. We have to go on to our next talk, and we will switch to German again. Thank you again very, very much.